Sathya Bala is the founder of My Skin, My Story, an online community for women of colour to connect, empower and elevate each other by sharing their stories. Sathya embodies the concepts of DEI both professionally and personally. She's a data leader in the luxury industry. Born in Singapore, as a Sri Lankan Tamil woman, she grew up in Sydney and moved to London as a young adult. In Sathya's own words, her passion and purpose is to speed up representation, equity, and positive social change for all those othered, in particular amplifying women of colour and intersectional identities. A very warm welcome to you today, Sathya. Thank you for joining Diversity Network.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, let's start with this. Can you explain what you mean by othered, Sathya?
Yeah, sure. And I think this can mean many things, right? And I believe we're in a really interesting time where we're each trying to understand beyond our own lived experiences. And I think when we look at the world, it doesn't really matter where you live, but there are certain, I guess, dominant groups where either our institutions, our media, our narratives, our histories tend to put certain dominant groups front and center. And so that can mean that a lot of people for different reasons feel othered. And I think this is something that is around equity for sure, because actually by being othered, that often means that you perhaps aren't given the same opportunities or the same freedoms, or you're not given the freedom to actually stand alone and not be a representative of your perhaps collective group that you represent. So for me personally, the dimensions where I feel othered are around race, skin color, ethnicity, religion, and gender. But for other people, it could be all sorts of things. It could be around neurodiversity, it could be around disability. For me, I have privileges where there are parts of me that aren't othered. So for example, I haven't had challenges with my gender identity. I also am a straight cis woman. So, and also I grew up pretty middle class, even though I do have an immigrant background, and we'll get into that when I share my journey. So, those othering elements are those classic kind of characteristics of diversity, right? Of actually how many deviations off the default normal are you? And that's why intersectionality to me is so important, because it's not about being other in one way. Actually, when you layer multiple of those characteristics, like, as again, I said, for me, race, ethnicity, and gender, it kind of has a multiplier effect in terms of sometimes that disadvantage and just how other you feel. So yeah, it's a really complex topic, but I think we can each be inspiration for people who are not just like us, but actually I think we all connect fundamentally on this kind of not belonging and feeling other. But for some of us, it's more institutionalized in terms of that kind of feeling marginalized out of the mainstream space.
And I suppose it's about treating each person as an individual, isn't it? Yeah. You can't necessarily put people into categories, can you? People, as you said, intersectionality is a really important side of DEI, isn't it?
Exactly. And actually the freedom of, if I fail at something, hopefully that just speaks on me and not behalf of a whole group of people. So I think I really enjoyed what you said there around individuality. And I think, the flip side of being other is privilege. And it's a real privilege when you're in a dominant group, and actually whether you do well or if you don't do well, it's not seen as actually that's how your whole group performs, if you know what I mean, which adds a lot of pressure. So yeah, individuality is important, and actually not making assumptions and just trying to connect on a human level and really understand each other without perhaps some preconceived notions of what certain characteristics could lead to. We're just humans at the end of the day.
Maybe COVID has helped that in a way. We've all experienced something together, haven't we? No matter how awful it is. Obviously, some people in some countries have been affected in different ways, but perhaps something like that will bring people together. You hope to be a role model for anyone who does not see themselves in positions of influence at work and in society. What role models did you have growing up, and who are your role models now?
Yeah, so I think role models is a really interesting topic. And I guess it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to be a role model. I automatically became one because I am what me and some of the women in My Skin, My Story, the community you mentioned, a term we've called being the unicorn. So actually sometimes, again, if you are a physical manifestation of a certain set of other categories, when you do well, or when you become a leader in the corporate space, you actually, whether you want to or not, become a role model, because people gravitate to you because finally they're seeing some people that represent them. I really enjoy that responsibility. But to that point, actually growing up, for me, I couldn't really tell you role models that looked like me. And so this is where I talk about actually you have to be quite creative with where you find your role models if you are someone from an underrepresented background. So I talk about this for women of color, but this applies to anyone. It could be around class, it could be around so many things. So for me, personally, my role models weren't people in the workplace, really. I saw people, I think, in artistic fields. I'm a lover of like the performance arts, of music, of dance. And I think I saw a bit more international representation and diversity of representation in those worlds. And I often think it's the arts that pushes our culture, and sometimes it's organizations that kind of follow, right? That really start to drive maybe people seeing things differently and saying, actually, I can relate to, and I can celebrate, and I can idolize people who look like anyone, not just people who look like me. So yeah, for me, it was really simple. I think a lot of us fell in love with Michelle Obama when she was coming up. For me, growing up, again, it was kind of musicians, and it wasn't always brown women, because again, I didn't always feel like I had access to that. So for me, I think I really latched on to strong Black women. So for me, when I was 16, I wanted to be Alicia Keys. She is still an inspiration for me, not just artistically, but the messages she puts out there, her commitment to her craft, but also providing positivity and elevating others. I think she has a real influence in her industry. So she's probably one that shows up. And then again, if I think of this conversation I've had with women of color in My Skin, My Story, the community I've built, a lot of those women, again, don't talk about obvious personalities, because again, we didn't always have people that we could relate to. So I often hear a lot of women of color talk about their own family members as their role models. So again, I think you kind of have to be a little creative, because they're perhaps not as easily found for certain people. So yeah, I'm a big fan of, don't just look at the corporate world, look around, don't just look up, look on either side, because inspiration can be found anywhere, and it's all about who inspires you, who pushes you, and who can you relate to.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? And being creative with your role models.
Exactly.
Well, Singapore is a multicultural society with 4 official languages: English, Malay, Mandarin, and Tamil. And you were born in Singapore. And in Australia, where you grew up, immigrants make up 30% of the population, the largest percentage in the Western world. How has growing up in a multicultural society influenced your way of thinking?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm very thankful that I've grown up in that environment, because I think there are certain things which weren't scary for me, because I do think sometimes we're just uncomfortable and a bit scared of the things we don't know and that we don't understand. I was really lucky that I got to know not just people in my community. So I was really lucky. There was a strong Sri Lankan Tamil community in Sydney, so I could feel that connection to my roots. But also there were so many really strong communities within Australia growing up. My school friends, cut across many kind of ethnic backgrounds and cultures. And actually it made things more interesting. It made things more fun. You know, even as a kid, we loved to go to each other's houses, and simple things like just trying different food, going to my first Greek wedding in year 4 for actually our teacher, because she was one of our favorite teachers, and she invited us all. And that wasn't my last one. And just kind of that exposure, I think one thing happens, you realize actually fundamentally we're all not very different at all. And it's because you live side by side with people from all sorts of backgrounds. And it's not just ethnicities. I think growing up in a big city, again, gives you a level of exposure of just so much, you know, in terms of class, in terms of religion. But Australia also had its challenges, right? And I think moving to the UK, I've also been able to look at my experiences in Australia with also more perspective, because actually there are still a lot of really excluded communities that when you grow up somewhere, you kind of take it as, well, that's the way things are. For example, how First Nation and Aboriginal people are treated. You know, I never came into contact in school, in university, or my first job, which was client facing. So I was often at different organizations every couple of weeks. I never had a conversation with an Aboriginal person. And that's something that I really started to think about when I moved, because then I started to see how things were different here. And again, each place has its positives and some of its drawbacks. But I think for me, it's just, you know, that exposure, living together with people from different backgrounds, I think it takes that fear element away. It's given me comfort in terms of dealing with people from different backgrounds. It's also given me an inherent curiosity, which I think is super helpful in the DEI world, to kind of lead with curiosity as opposed to a fear of failure, because it is a really sensitive and sometimes emotional subject that we feel that we can't make any mistakes on, but actually that prevents our progress. And then it's also kind of given me the ability to put myself in other people's shoes, which I think is really helpful, because I think empathy building is so much easier when you have exposure. So I don't take that for granted. If I lived somewhere that was far more isolated, it would be much easier to kind of listen to certain narratives or to be afraid of people who are different. So I think for me, delicious food, fun festivities, learning cultures, but then also really developing that empathy and curiosity, and it kind of dispels a lot of fear in terms of, you know, tricky topics that maybe some people feel uncomfortable talking about. If you just share living side by side, I think it can feel far more organic to kind of tackle some of these subjects.
It's also much more interesting, isn't it? Life is much more interesting when there's diversity of people, culture, music, fashion, food.
Exactly.
I lived in Sydney for 2 years and Alice Springs for 2 years.
Okay.
And I was really surprised when I came to Sydney that the only Aboriginal people I saw were in Circular Quay as a tourist sort of attraction, playing the didgeridoo, and there was no one at work and nobody in the shops or hotels and I was really surprised, because obviously the population percentage in Central Australia is very different, the population makeup, but I was still really surprised that that people hadn't been able to move to Sydney or hadn't wanted to and pursue a career in the city or a life in the city. But as you say, it is a complicated subject, isn't it? We could probably have a whole discussion on.
and this is where I think actually fresh perspectives, and actually I think, you know, if you have, again, the privilege, these are all privileges of traveling and living in different places. I have learned a lot, because actually I learn a lot about the country or the city that I moved to, but also it gives me a perspective and a different mechanism to reflect on the places I've been and the places I've lived. And you learn new things as well in that perspective, right? Because you actually just start to critique and interrogate and reassess things, which I think, again, is really healthy in this topic, because it's all about kind of breaking what we think used to be normal, or what we think is an acceptable problem. And actually now there isn't the threshold to put up with certain things. And I think it's really that fresh perspective, or even talking to new people, different people, it gives you not just that new knowledge in the moment, but a different lens to kind of look back. And so I have found that really helpful myself in terms of being hyper aware in terms of how I move through the UK. Because again, when you're new, you're sussing out a new country and a culture and trying to figure out all the unwritten rules and the certain kind of coded language that every country and culture has. But then it also kind of gave me a point of comparison, right? Compared to Australia. So yeah, and it's just fun. I love to learn. And as you say, I think when you live in these cities and grow up, you see the benefits far outweigh any kind of negative narratives around multiculturalism. So yeah, for me, you know, I wouldn't be who I am if that didn't exist, because I have you know, parents, family, relatives, all different immigrant stories. And so it's really, you know, that immigrant journey is part of that kind of multicultural upbringing, which I'm valuing more and more as I get older.
Well, leading on from that, can you talk about what you've learned about DEI and your lived experience comparing your time in Australia and the UK?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, and I think this is something that is coming up a lot in terms of conversations with family, with friends, but also in the workplace, which is, what is our comfort level talking about these tricky subjects? You know, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality, intersectionality, as I've mentioned before. And I guess one of the things I've noticed is actually sometimes how we approach hard topics like DEI is a symptom of just how we tend to relate with each other. So I know this is a bit of a funny one, but a lot of the times when Australians move over, there are some really funny kind of jokes and memes that get shared around the Aussies in London community, which is when an English person says this, you know, someone from another country thinks they mean that, but actually they mean the opposite, right? Which is that, because actually, you know, I learned when my first job actually in London at a bank, I thought I was being complimented, but this is where actually I learned after a bit of time that it was kind of a coded insult, which was I kept being told, oh, you're really direct. In Australia, that's a compliment, to be really direct in terms of how you work and how you communicate. Whereas I learned it was actually code for, I was coming across as perhaps too direct, too abrupt, not doing enough of the kind of talking around a subject to warm people up, which is kind of a bit more of a UK cultural thing, you know, in terms of workplaces. I always joke with friends that when I used to write emails back in Australia, I would just get to the point and write the email. Now, and I've lived in London and worked in London for 13 years, I still write emails and then I have to add a sentence at the top and a sentence at the bottom before I send it, so it doesn't come across as too direct. So I know that might sound like a bit of a tangent, but the point is actually that kind of is also how DEI is kind of talked about. And so I think in some ways, I think because the UK is more sometimes central to political conversations, and I think also in terms of the geographic location, the UK feels more connected with the world, whereas Australia can feel a little bit kind of isolated and in its own bubble. I think because there's so many ties with Europe and the US, in some ways, I think there's a lot of conversation happening in DEI, and perhaps there's a bit more thinking and there are more people that work in the profession. I think Australia's catching up. But then in some ways, I look at the US and I really value how direct they are when they talk about things and talk about problems. Whereas I do think there is a culture in the UK of not wanting to talk about problems too much. And then if we're talking about DEI, it's like, well, then how do we jump that hurdle of that inherent want to not be, maybe being direct is seen as confrontational, right? So how do we have these tough conversations? I think a lot of people have been trying to navigate that, whether it was in response to these kind of really traumatic, racially fueled events that have happened, where actually these things weren't talked about. Whereas when I grew up in Australia, we kind of talked and joked about race more openly with each other than, say, people here. So I think, you know, there's many things that I can reflect on, but I think for me, I'll bring it back to that intersectionality piece, which I'm really passionate about. I think moving to the UK, I'm not just a brown woman, a Sri Lankan woman, I'm an Australian Sri Lankan Tamil woman, right? Because I'm not surrounded by Australians. Whereas in Australia, that bit was kind of irrelevant. So one thing I have noticed in terms of my lived experience is people, English people, Europeans, Americans, whoever I'm dealing with in the UK, they will hear my accent and quickly go, oh, she's Australian. Okay, I feel comfortable. But then the other part of my identity is then kind of no longer broached. So people will meet me and kind of within a minute want to talk about the cricket or tell me about their relatives who live in Australia, or that time they did a great backpacking trip, and they'll ask me not just what city I'm from, but what suburb, because they know so much about Australia and Sydney. And so they get to know this part of my identity really, really well. They feel really comfortable talking about it and exploring it and showing that curiosity. But all the other bits, which in some ways feel more fundamental to me because they're what make me more different from the mainstream. So you kind of have to reconcile those parts of yourself more, I think. It feels like that's kind of a topic that people are scared to explore. And so when you have a part of yourself that it's not just people enjoy talking about, but they get to the nth degree of digging into your Aussie-ness, and then this huge chunk of me is like not talked about at all. I think I've really experienced that in the UK, how, accent versus nationality versus ethnicity. And there are the comfortable ones that people feel are like not touchy and won't take them into a dangerous territory of conversation or offending someone. But actually the person on the other side can feel like you're dismissing a big chunk of who they are. And so that's been a really, really interesting reflection for me, and something that I've kind of had to tackle with. And in some ways, I've had to spend more time kind of thinking what my Sri Lankan Tamil identity means to me coming here, because it's kind of not, it's not engaged with like the other parts of my identity of being Australian.
When I was in Australia, one thing I noticed was if there was an Italian festival, for example, everyone was welcome to the Italian festival, not just Italians. Whereas in the UK, if there was an Italian festival, maybe some people would go, but it would mostly be the Italian community that went. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. So I think, you know what, like everything, it's a double-edged, I don't want to say sword, that sounds painful, but like say a double-edged coin, where I think, actually there's some things I really love about the UK, where actually just the scale of population, because you've been in Australia, like Australia, even though Sydney is a big kind of cosmopolitan, multicultural, metropolitan city, it's still kind of very small compared to, the top 2-3 cities in the UK. Having lived in London, what I love is that if there was an Italian festival, or if there was Diwali, for example, or we just came out of South Asian Heritage Month in the UK, and it's the second year they've ever done that. What I love is actually there is such a strong foothold of various cultures, where I am still in awe of just kind of the scale of some of these festivals and events, because I do feel like in London, the sky's the limit of kind of how big and brash those cultural celebrations are. And so there is something about, actually, I feel like those communities are in some ways more tightly knit, because also there's been far longer generations of immigration, right? Australia, there hasn't been. So I love that part of it, because it's just, the scale and the amount of festivities, the amount of different cultures that are celebrated on at different times of the year are amazing. But I get your point. I think there is maybe in some ways the fact that we have these things in Australia, I think they don't feel politicized, whereas I do think here sometimes the narratives of things get a little bit politicized, or again, I think people are worried to offend each other. And I think that's far more of a UK mentality than in Australia. So actually, if they're like, oh, if I go to a Diwali event and I do the wrong thing, or I might feel like I stick out. And so I think, I haven't thought about it before, but I think you're right. I feel like you get less of that kind of everyone showing up out of that curiosity. And that's the thing I love about Australia. I've had people tell me, I've been to Australia and I find it, far more racist than the UK. And I think it really depends on the individual. I have not had that experience, but I don't think that's the same as saying maybe I've heard more people say things less politically correct in Australia than the UK, but that doesn't mean I was more offended there. Because I think, again, it comes back down to this curiosity of, in Australia, people are curious. And if they stuff up, they'll kind of fess up and they'll be like, look, I tried, and, they'll try to connect with that person and make a joke out of it or something. But it's like, people are curious. They just want to see it. They want to be part of it. They want to learn. And that's the primary driver. It's not, oh, what if I do something wrong? Whereas I've noticed here that, there's such a focus on not saying the wrong thing. And again, I'm not even talking about DEI. This is just kind of generally when I moved, I noticed that. Whereas, Australians will just say things. And then, if it comes from a place where, of course, not offensive, but if it comes from a place where there's a good intention and that person's curious and trying to learn, at least they're engaging, whereas I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of fear, and I think there's a reason, because again, there's a long history of things here in the UK, whereas in Australia, if I can speak to some of the immigrant experience, so many of the immigrant groups came in a short period of time. So there isn't this kind of tension between groups, because it's all a bit of a mix. If someone comes up to me and says, go back to your country in Australia, I can say that back to a white person, because actually the majority of white people are descendants of convicts. So this feeling of like superiority and who really belongs here in Australia, I feel like is a bit different to here. And it almost feels like things are less charged because of that. Because actually that, I think there's always that joke of like Aussies always go for the underdog, and we don't like people to be like too proud of themselves. And so I think at the end of the day, it's everyone has come from somewhere, right? Unless you're Aboriginal, First Nations. And so that kind of takes something away from debates that can kind of come up. And so there's a bit more of a sparring energy and that curiosity and like being okay to fail as long as you're coming at it from the right place. Whereas here, I think everything is charged with a bit of history over a long period of time. And people just don't want to do the wrong thing. And then that stops that curiosity.
That's a very eloquent way of summing it up, I think. Well, speaking a bit more about your Sri Lankan side then, do you think initiatives like the South Asian Festival and South Asian Awareness Month will help people feel less inhibited if they obviously clearly more people go on holiday to Australia than they do Sri Lanka, so maybe that's why they don't speak to you about that side of things. But do you think those kinds of initiatives will help people be more aware of different countries and not be afraid to ask you about that side of yourself?
Yeah, I think I was really, and if anyone's interested that's watching this, you can Google I think the first year they launched it, which was in 2020, there's this beautiful 1.5 to 2 minute video that kind of explains through a poem with some beautiful images of different members of the South Asian community in the UK, just kind of why that heritage is important. And so, yeah, I think those things are great because I think it gives ownership of, especially when they're these like official months and history months, they do tend to be a lot more about education and learning, which I think inherently opens the door that it's not just for us, right? Because we know our history, but even then there's bits of our history we don't, because there's a culture of not talking about things because it has been a painful history for some of us. But, the whole point of these things is actually for other people to learn. So I do think more of those things are helpful. I think there hasn't yet been enough awareness that these things exist. So, what I'd love to see that next year organizations really take the time to look at, based on where they are, regionally, look at those UN international days, look at the history months that are in your area. And it's not just like a tick box exercise, actually where you have colleagues from those communities, these things are quite meaningful. And so, yeah, I think it'll open up the conversation. But at the end of the day, I also think we can't wait for those things to happen, right? I think we've all got a sense of urgency and wanting to make change. And I would say for me personally, it's not about, I love talking about being Australian, you know, I'm not complaining about that, but actually, it, you know, as you get to know someone, don't avoid topics, you know, try and go with that natural flow, try to connect on a human level. And actually, just like you understand people's friends, family, the food that they like, their cultures come out through that. And I think, you know, if a red flag comes up in your head, oh, I think we're getting into territory that's going into certain ethnicities I'm not comfortable with, don't pull yourself back, just kind of go with it. Because there's, you know, a middle ground between someone only talking to me about me being Australian, and then the other extreme is the second they meet me, they say, where are you from? Right? Because that's, again, not organic, and you trying to understand, it can feel like when you're on the receiving end that you're not from here, so explain yourself, right? Because you're different. But you know, that shouldn't be the second or third thing that comes out of your mouth. Like, I wouldn't ask that. You know, I wouldn't. It's just like when you go to a networking thing. Another funny thing, and then I'll stop because I can talk forever. The other comparison when you come to the UK is, I took relief being Australian because I noticed at some of these like more, let's say, fancy corporate networking events, and perhaps it's more in certain traditional industries where perhaps there's more of a sense of class, and you know, it's more affluent, wealthy people that have gone into an industry, where actually as soon as I was at a corporate networking thing, I was so relieved I was Australian, because all the English people had to get into a conversation of, hi, my name is this, and then within 5 seconds, what school did you go to, where did you grow up, what university? And you're doing that check, right, where you're saying, okay, is this someone that's like in my league, or is this someone that belongs here? Or, and it's that same feeling, right, when someone's like, I'm just curious, where are you from? But if that's the kind of the first few things that comes out, it feels like a transactional question, or a question where I'm being challenged to explain my validity. Whereas if it's just kind of, you know, comes up in follow-on conversations in building a relationship with someone, just like if someone spent time talking to me, they would realize I was, you know, obsessed with dance and obsessed with gigs. You know, by the time I've talked about that for 3 conversations, I feel like it's an okay time to be curious about my Sri Lankan background, right? It's that relationship building, but it can't be these one-time kind of transactional bits where you're trying to excavate knowledge or trying to kind of place someone and see if they belong or not.
Mm. Well, leading on from that, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you, Sathya?
Yeah, so I think for me, I come at it with a few hats. So, you know, in my professional journey, I found that for me, it's actually something that can galvanize organizations and groups of disparate people on a unified goal. You know, I'm finding being a data leader, I'm doing a lot trying to actually see how we as a data professional community enable and support the DEI agenda, because actually we each have a role to play. And I actually think we have some amazing skills on the data side that are so needed by our DEI leaders who are being inundated with all these kind of complex data problems being thrown their way. So to me, it's, you know, DEI is about getting involved, you know, what professional capacity and knowledge and skills can help. For me, it's also, it cannot be looked at in isolation. For me, it's about a broader life purpose, which is I really want equity in the world. I want positive social change, but I am someone who's worked through quite a traditional professional journey. So my sphere of influence is the corporate world. So that's where I'm going to start. And to me, social change and equity in the world, in the microcosm of the corporate world, to me is DEI. That's the label that we've given it, right? So I think it's much bigger, but it's about how can you use your professional skills, your influence to actually make our workplaces and our industries, because actually the corporate world is where we spend our money, and it's where we kind of put a lot of power, and this is where a lot of people are employed. So actually we have such influence on broader society. So to me, it's about elevating people who are underrepresented, bringing everyone into the conversation, having a tailored approach as well, because I think different places have different challenges. You know, I work in an international organization. I think we all very quickly learn that how DEI is perceived in different places, and where perhaps the dynamics are different really depends on what part of the world you're in. But to me, ultimately, I think DEI is about, as individuals, we realize that we all want to be able to define success on our own terms. That is the purpose of My Skin, My Story. Our mission is actually for women of color. How do we empower, connect, elevate women to share their stories, but eventually so that they're defining success on their own terms? And so to me, I think DEI is, how do we break away those barriers that have previously told us that to be successful at work, you need to look a certain way, or to lead at work, you need to have a certain style, right? Or to be someone who is taken seriously, you have to have certain characteristics, but actually kindness and empathy is weakness, right? So these are things, to me, it's actually kind of breaking away those unhelpful barriers, and then actually saying, right, wherever you are, how do we give people what they need so that they can be successful? Because actually, if individuals are successful, our businesses will be so much more productive.
And why are you looking forward to speaking at Inclusion 2021?
So I think for me, I love community. You know, I am a community builder, but I think for me, this topic is complex, and the only way we get through it is actually by hearing from each other and talking to each other. So I'm really excited by this conference, because for me, I'm going to be a participant. You know, my main thing is actually I want to learn and be inspired by other people. But I think I've also realized that, back to my earlier point on role modeling, I think someone with my lived experience, it's also important to bring that into the conversation. And for me, I've realized I actually enjoy using my voice and sharing my story. And actually, not everyone does feel that confident. So actually, I'm really excited to be able to do that. And actually really not just share my story, but as I said, kind of learn and hear from other people, but bringing people together that are interested in inclusion and are trying to drive it forward. I mean, those are the people that I want to be spending time with. So that's why I'm excited.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Sathya. I think you have been really brave at sharing your personal story and talking about other people's as well. And I can see why that you have described yourself and your colleagues as unicorns, because you are, you know, you what you're saying is something that people may not have heard before. So that's really important. And I know that our listeners will have found it really useful today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.